Hello and welcome to our audience. Welcome to Transnational Times Podcast, a Jadalia program dedicated to connecting activists, thinkers, artists, and movements across the globe who are thinking about our collective conditions of domination and our shared pathways to liberation. Today's guest exemplifies this energy and dedication. I'm so excited to welcome Dr. Charisse Burden-Stelly, also known as Dr. CBS. Dr. CBS is an associate professor of African American Studies at Wayne State University. Congratulations. And a member of the Black Alliance for Peace Research and Political Education team. She is a critical Black studies scholar of political theory, political economy, intellectual history, and historical sociology. She is the co-author with Dr. Gerald Horne of W.E.B. Du Bois, A Life in American History. She is currently working on a manuscript titled Black Scare, Red Scare, Anti-Blackness, Anticommunism, and the Rise of Capitalism in the United States. Small things. And is with us today to discuss her most recent book, Organize, Fight, Win, an anthology edited along with Jodi Dean of 3 decades of Black communist women's political writing. Welcome to the program, Charisse. You're on mute.
Am I?
No, you're not. So welcome to the
Okay, no.
program, Charisse.
Yeah, thank you for having me. I'm glad to be here.
I'm so excited to be in conversation with you. We were talking about this a little bit off air, but I've enjoyed watching what you're doing, learning as you learn. You are a dedicated student and a teacher, and doing that out loud to our benefit. I want to start by congratulating you on this excellent work. And as I was saying earlier, I was so excited by this, not only because it lifts up, right, invisibilized work of Black women, right, their intellectual work, but it's also lifting up the organizing work. As an organizer, being able to read these notes of, right, how mamas were brought out in order to defend the Scottsboro Boys, or how folks were organized on what's known as the Bronx slave market, or was known as the Bronx slave market, or otherwise within trade unions or anti-fascist movements, right? There was one essay, she came back from Paris without Chanel, right?
Mm-hmm.
About what it meant to go organize abroad from the United States and to connect these struggles. And it was just so, we were immersed in that on the ground work, knowing full well that the activist is actually what provides for us the theory, right? Activists are our greatest theorists. So before we jump in to discuss the various themes in it, I wanted to start by asking you to provide us a summary of the book, your inspiration for it, along with Jodi Dean, why you organized it chronologically, what it goes from 1925 to 1956, and your method for finding and choosing the texts that you included.
Sure. So, this book came about because Jodi was teaching a class, I want to say, on like Black feminism or something like that. And she had a student in that class that couldn't find a particular piece by Louise Thompson Patterson. And then Jodi couldn't find it. And so she emailed me. And then I have a lot of just archival documents. I'm like an archive rat. I just spend all my time in archives. And then I didn't have it. And so basically we started a conversation like, these works should be easily accessible. There's no reason why we should have to sort of search for these things. And so that is the sort of basis of why we put together the collection. And so we began to just kind of brainstorm, who do we want to include, what types of writings do we want to include, what the time period was that we wanted to cover. And so we chose the period 1919 to 1956 because that's kind of like the origins of the Communist Party in the United States. So initially there were kind of two that merged into one, but that was also the founding of the African Blood Brotherhood, which was a revolutionary nationalist organization. And so Grace Campbell, for example, was one of the founders of the ABB, who went on to become a member of the Communist Party as the two merged. And then 1956, because that's a sort of pivotal moment. That's the kind of heart of McCarthyism, which was one reason why many people began to believe the Communist Party. It was also the year of the so-called Khrushchev revelations. Um, particular practices of Joseph Stalin, which was another reason why folks left. And so it was just kind of a pivotal moment in the CP. And so one of the reasons why we organized the book chronologically as opposed to thematically is because of the overlapping themes. So part of what these women's praxis conveys is that the struggle against fascism is intimately bound up in the struggle against patriarchy and or male chauvinism, against sort of racial chauvinism, imperialism, colonialism, et cetera. And so we couldn't have just a section on anti-imperialism because the anti-fascist struggle is anti-imperialist, for example. The anti-racist struggle is anti-imperialist. And so chronology was helpful in that fashion. It also kind of shows that, you know, there's this saying like history doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes. And so over this longue durée, the themes are similar. There's obviously different strategies, there's different pivots that the women are making, but the issue of police brutality, for example, is extraordinarily durable. The issue of colonialism, the issue of racial subjection, of lynching, these are concerns that permeate the period that we're looking at, as well as the fact that Black women throughout that period are primarily in domestic service. So much of how they understand who counts as a worker and what a worker is organized around Black women in private domestic service, as well as in the sort of in the service industry. And so that's sort of how the book came together. But, you know, me and Jodi and I like to kind of read all of the women who we profile in the book every time we do a talk. And so I'll just kind of read the names so people can get a sense of who's in the book. So we've got Ella Baker, Carlotta Bass, Dorothy Burnham, Williana Burroughs, Grace P. Campbell, Alice Childress, Marvell Cook, Esther Cooper Jackson, Thelma Dale Perkins, Tyra Edwards, Vicki Garvin, Yvonne Gregory, Lorraine Hansberry, Dorothy Hunton, Claudia Jones, Maud White Katz, Louise Thompson Patterson, and Eslanda Good Robeson. So, and then I'll just mention that these women are communist and communist adjacent. So not everybody was in the Communist Party. Some people were in organizations that were around or in conversation with the Communist Party. So, for example, Dorothy Hunton wasn't a member of the Communist Party, nor was Carlotta Bass, but was certainly what one might call a fellow traveler.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that was also very enlightening for me to read this and to, you know, so many names I had recognized and so many I had never heard of. Right. I mean, Williana Burroughs is so central to all of the organizing work that we're reading. And she's, you know, throughout the book, she's in throughout this collection. And yet I had never heard of her. So thank you for that labor. Let's get into the core of the book. Right. And to some of its major themes. You know, for me reading it, the core addresses obviously the entwinements of race, class, and gender. It's providing a diagnosis for our social, economic, and political afflictions in a very complex way, right? There's no flattening. There's no single solution. There's no silver bullet to get us through this, but it provides a vision for how we should struggle for one another, right? It's what's summed up by, you know, the first author that you lifted up, who, Jodi, her student, and you were looking for, Louise Thomas Patterson, in her essay, Toward a Brighter Dawn, when she describes the triple exploitation endured by Black women as, quote, workers, as women, and as Negroes, right? As an aside, right, this, I've never personally referenced this as the initial articulation of intersectionality as a theory, and here we have yet such a vivid offering of it, even before, right before Kimberly Crenshaw, but even before Frances Beale, right, gives us that framing. But back to the theme of your book, to unpacking this. The book, for me, first and foremost, is a damning rebuke, once again, of the myth that class struggle alone can overcome the race question. Yes, it's true, and you make clear here and elsewhere that anti-Blackness is not a primordial condition, but one connected to particular economic global systems. You've unearthed this, you know, in the work in your collection on W.E. Du Bois. Walter Rodney has done this. Later, it's popularized by Cedric Robinson as racial capitalism. However, class struggle throughout the 1930s demonstrated the limits of labor struggle and in fact led to much disenchantment among Black radicals in the potential of what class struggle could achieve. Inversely, and more recently, I've heard you describe the vision of Black wealth accumulation, right? Like if you could just recreate a Black Wall Street or some sort of self-sufficiency, so on and so forth, that if there could be achieved a social class a class status, that somehow that can overcome racism. And you've described it as goofy. Anyway, you're telling us something here that's super instructive about the relationship of race and class. And I would love for us to walk through that lesson by revisiting the initial commitment to class struggle as having that potential to overcome racism, but also the disenchantment with it as a panacea. And at some point, right, it becomes clear that white supremacy on its own is an organizing principle of society that has to be also addressed head on and not merely by proxy. So
Mm-hmm.
how is that so, and how do you think that's apparent today?
Mm-hmm. Well, so first, I just want to sort of clarify that triple oppression is not the precursor to intersectionality. And so I say this every time I talk about the book. Intersectionality is a different sort of epistemological framework. And so I think that what happens is that because of the what folks call like, misogynoir on the one hand, and because of intellectual McCarthyism are the suppression of sort of Black, just radical people generally, and Black radicals work particularly, what has happened is this construction of like a sort of homogenous or an unbroken Black women's intellectual tradition, which would then state, right, that you go from like Anna Julia Cooper, well, probably, Mariah Stewart, to all the people in the middle, including Claudia Jones, to Kimberly Crenshaw. I disagree with that. I think that there's different political horizons of triple oppression and of intersectionality. Triple oppression is constitutively anti-imperialist, and it is about Black women's relationship to the capitalist mode of production. That's a different political project. So that is to say a different what. And if it's a different so what, then intersectionality, that is to say what is to be done. So I just wanted to clarify that. I'm not saying one is better than the other, but I think that we need to have that politics matter, right? And so I don't want us to sort of elide triple oppression with intersectionality as if they're interchangeable, because they are fundamentally different sort of political projects. That being said, the other thing too is that I wouldn't say that Black people became disenchanted with the class project in the 1930s. I think it's the content of the class struggle and how it was codified in the 1930s, primarily under the Popular Front era. Black people always understood the Negro question as central to any class analysis, and at a particular historical moment, especially in the sort of third period of the Communist Party or the Communist International, which was the class versus class. This is when the Black Belt Nation thesis and the right to self-determination for the Negro people in the Black Belt was taken most seriously. There was a pivot away from that in the 1930s. And we have a piece by Claudia Jones called On the Right to Self-Determination of the Negro People in the Black Belt that critiques that sort of move away from the Black Belt Nation thesis. So that is to say that it wasn't a move away from class struggle as such, but a move away from the sort of multifaceted way that the Communist Party was waging the class struggle that included the Negro question as central, and that included a sort of an deep understanding of the national oppression of Black people, especially those in the Black belts of the Southern United States. And so, because I don't want to make it seem as if I don't want to sort of make a sort of race reductionist argument where a focus on class or focus on race, excuse me, can be devoid of a class analysis, right? And so I think at the same time, from the outset, Black people, generally Black women particularly, who are in the Communist Party, were always waging a struggle against white chauvinism. They were waging a struggle to take the so-called Negro work seriously. So Williana Burroughs has a few reports where she's talking about the failures, right, of that work. And so Black people who care about class never become disenchanted about class. They become disenchanted with who counts as a worker, who is at the, not even at the center, but who is included in the analysis of class struggle, who are the revolutionary subjects. And that, of course, changes over time when fascism becomes the central target of, of communist organizing, so to speak. Then I think that the disenchantment comes, for example, with the pivot away from a central focus on imperialism, on colonialism, again, on self-determination. And so I think that that's where the disenchantment comes in. But there wasn't a moment from the 1919, where we start in 1919 onward, where the Negro question wasn't sort of central. And in fact, Claudia Jones, in another piece we didn't include here, talks about, the Negro question is actually prior to the woman question. And what she's saying is not that the woman question is not important, but that in the context of the United States, white supremacy and racial domination cannot be separated from capitalist exploitation, period. Not least because of the national character of Black oppression that emanates from racial slavery. I think that now they would have added settler colonialism in that framework. One of the sort of shortcomings of the Communist Party in general, and even the Black thinkers, was that there was like no engagement with settler colonialism or the indigenous question. And so that this is why we have to think alongside, but not try to reproduce wholesale or simply demonstrate mastery of these writings. We have to update it to understand our particular historical moment and to kind of broaden that analysis so we can have a robust understanding of like what is to be done. I think I answered most of that question.
I think you did what you promised, which was to respond, but not necessarily to answer the question. So I think that was
Yeah.
wonderful and very educational as well, instructive on how we frame a question and understand the different epistemological projects of what it is, what of the what, so what.
Oh, I forgot one thing.
Oh, go
I did
ahead.
forget the black capitalist class,
Oh,
like that.
yes,
The
yes. We're gonna get
yeah,
more into that as well, but
right, yeah, just I call it the niggerati, right? They're not going to save us. And that term niggerati actually comes from like the Harlem Renaissance, which was like the upper crust or like the vanguard of like the Harlem Renaissance, the elite blacks. But the reason why that is not possible is because just because Black people accumulate wealth, that says nothing about ethics, epistemology, or politics, which is to say, it says nothing about how Black people will relate to each other and will relate to the community. It says nothing about how Black people fundamentally understand the world and therefore the problems emanating therefrom. And it says nothing about the politics, which is the so what. That is to say, so accumulating wealth says nothing about wealth distribution, first of all, and second of all, because of the realities of white supremacy and of Black anti-Black racial oppression, oftentimes like Black entrepreneurship. Black entrepreneurship is concentrated in small or medium-sized firms, and they can all be hyper exploitative, not because Black people are constitutively exploitative, but because of the nature of starting a business. It's more expensive to get a loan. You generally have you pay workers less because your customer base is smaller because you're competing with these large corporations. It's more expensive to get insurance, and so it reproduces relations of exploitation, even if it's allowing some people in the community to accumulate wealth. And those people don't always demonstrate a responsibility to redistribute that wealth or even to invest in the community. So, that's mythology.
I think, the work that you're doing here. So I get introduced to you, Charisse, in your 2020 review of Isabel Wilkerson's book. You're excited about this. I was excited to read it. Cast the Origins of Our Discontent, right? Wilkerson offers, she sums up race in the United States as a matter of attitude, it's feeling. In one place, you describe it in your review as meanness, like it's just folks being mean. Like, how is it somebody who doesn't have as many degrees as former President Barack Obama can denigrate him, right? There's like this feeling of right. It's a lot. It's very attitudinal. Anyway, in your masterful review, you reveal at least two things. First is the significance of being able to place, our analysis of the what in its material and historical context in a series of contingencies that makes up the present. So because of
Mhm.
that, right, you're immediately critical, as we should be, of a comparison to India that completely takes for granted, right, that where caste comes from in India is different than where race
Mhm.
as a construct related to capitalism comes from in the United States, right? So what does
Mhm.
that elision do for us, and how does it hamper us in terms of our political organizing? The second thing that you do is that you highlight, as you just did here, the significance of the shortcomings and the even the counter-revolutionary role of Black elite in the United States. So, I mean, I initially wanted you to focus on the Black elite question, but you kind of touched on that. So I just want to open it up that if you want to tell us a little bit more about the significance of those historical contingencies and how they empower us to have a more solid analysis, um, ask you to do that work here, or to get farther into the work of what is the problematic of focusing on a Black
Mhm.
elite, and how has that shaped historical legacies of Black struggle in the United States, for example, that have shaped Black struggle isn't homogenous. Black people are not homogenous. How has that shaped different historical strands of struggle?
Mhm. Yeah, so I mean, I think the first thing to know is that the Black bourgeoisie and the Black petty bourgeois is a dependent class, not unlike the sort of comprador class in the global South. They're not a sort of independent class. Always their method of accumulation is mitigated or is contingent upon um, you know white largesse and or sort of some type of dependent relationship to the mainstream. And so what that has meant is that oftentimes that class has served as the buffer class, or as Glenn Ford calls it, as the misleadership class. You see, what's interesting is that in the United States, the only people that you hear about that need leaders is Black people. And I think that that's a sort of a historically situated phenomenon, because Black people, whether we start with sort of a Booker T. Washington or even before and move forward, there has always been some sort of leader, generally male, that has been put forth to sort of um, to lead the Black community. And what that has often been classed. It has always been classed. It's never sort of a poor person working at Home Depot that's the Black leader, right? um and it has to do with sort of a brokerage type of relationship, whereby whoever the leader or leadership class is, sort of, they palliate the masses, right? They're meant to neutralize the masses while offering up maybe very basic concessions that are not redistributive in function and that don't improve the material conditions of the majority, but they work to sort of broker particular relationships between the white ruling class and the Black masses. And then what can happen, and this is a representational model, right? That because Black people have generally been denied individualism, we have always been seen as a group. The logic is that if one of us succeeds, all of us succeeds, and so we push to get any Black in power, irrespective of what their commitments are. And so then what happens to the Black elite or the Black bourgeoisie, or contemporarily like the Black celebrity class, is said to be a reflection of what's happening to us, and that their wins are our wins, which is just not the case. Even if it is that, if a rich person, so for example, the example I always give is when like Skip Gates at Harvard got arrested outside
Mm-hmm.
of his home, and then he was able to call Barack Obama. When George Floyd or Philando Castile or Breonna Taylor or Sandra Bland, and the list goes on and on and on, when they encounter the cops because they are Black and working class or poor, they die. And that is a fundamentally different relationship. And so there's no trickle down justice, right? You can't say that what the Black elite with wealthy Blacks are able to afford, or the sort of proximity they have to power, will afford the same outcomes for people who don't have that access, right? For people who are constitutively subjected to violence and exclusion, and without super exploitation, so to speak. And so I think that that's the problem with that sort of class model. at the same time, I will say that it's important to note, for example, in Organized Fight When, many of those women were petty bourgeois or were kind of, upper class Black women, people like Louise Thompson Patterson and Marvell Cook, even Esther Cooper Jackson, but they committed class suicide. So, Amilcar Cabral has this, he has this concept of class suicide where even if you have a particular position structurally, how you ethically situate yourself in a type of struggle in which you engage can effectively be a disavowal of that class. And I think that that's really important because we have to take seriously the idea that there is a small but powerful Black bourgeoisie, petty bourgeoisie, misleadership class. And so if we just throw them away outright, then that's an abdication that allows them an abdication of responsibility. But what we have to do is not rely on them to lead us, but push them and expect them to commit that class suicide to ground with the overwhelming majority of Black people. We are a proletarian race. We're overwhelmingly a race of workers. And so it is that voice that should be lifted up. It is those people who we should care about, not when your favorite celebrity gets has some is subjected to some injustice. And same goes for like influencers, right? Or your favorite academics, whomever. I think that is what becomes extraordinarily problematic. And the problem is exacerbated in the United States because number one, we're the most highly propagandized nation in the world, and number two, it's such a celebrity culture that has been exacerbated by influencerism that we ground our analysis in that. And so for when sort of Offset, for example, from the Migos loses his life, then that becomes the basis of our analysis of we want to see Black men grow old. Meanwhile, poor Black boys and men every day are murdered at alarming rates by the police and by each other because of the material conditions in which they live. So that should be the basis of the analysis, not when the celebrity dies, right? Or for example, when so I think that that's where the class question and the race question, they have to be understood together. And that says nothing of the sort of imperialism question, but yeah.
Well, I definitely want to get to the imperialism question as well. I think you're emphasizing here, this primary lesson of understanding Black struggle as an anti-capitalist struggle, and understanding an anti-capitalist struggle as an anti-racist struggle as well, right? How these projects, these are political projects that are sutured in order to expand, right, particular wealth amongst a particular class based on exploitation. And I have some thoughts on the influencer piece, and I know we can riff on that, but let me hold up so that we can get through some of the. Well, let me just say this. It's very problematic, and it's actually the indications of how influencers and how they can monetize what they do. We've seen a little bit of that, and how much more it's happening. Apparently, the horizon is looking like removing the middle person, removing the platform altogether, so that those with capital can invest directly in the influencer themselves as the product. Anyway, I mean, it's underscoring what you're telling us about the hyper propagandization, the individualization, and this fixation on celebrity as opposed to movement in our collective work.
But it also encourages us to turn everything into a commodity, even social justice. Like I tweeted the other day, like organizers should not be celebrities. Organizers should not be celebrities. And that's different than saying that. So for somebody brought up the example of Mark Lamont Hill. He's not famous for being an organizer. That's not to say that he's not an organizer, but his fame is linked to other things, his media work. But there are people who have become famous ostensibly as activists and organizers, which however you want to cut it, it means that you've pimped the movement in some way, that you have made the movement into a commodity in some way. When you're on the cover of magazines, when you're going to the Grammys, when you're doing all of these things, how are you serving the people? That's crazy. And then keeping that spotlight becomes the work. That's crazy to me. And
I definitely hear you. Go ahead. Sorry.
No, go ahead. I was just gonna say, I just feel like influencerism and influencer culture, which is basically micro celebrity culture, encourages that get the bag, like commodify everything, do it for the culture type of mentality, which is, I just think that that is anathema to any understanding of liberation.
I think that that's absolutely right. I think that there's also I think about like young organizers, right? And how they work and how they're moving. It's one thing to work towards trying to get on a magazine. It's another thing to work to where you have an audience and support, and you can actually inspire people. Folks like Chris Smalls, who has been an organizer, who does, for lack of a better word, have a platform he can use in order to expand and organize better, but isn't necessarily moving towards the same horizon. So how do we navigate that in nuanced ways so that we can support folks who are organizers and encourage others to pursue that path? It's a difficult path. It's a difficult path, and it's one of very challenging. Are you biting your lip? Because I
I
said that.
don't, yeah, I don't necessarily share that perspective. I don't think we need audiences. I think we need comrades and we need a mass movement. And the problem is that those two have become conflated. I just can't get with it. And I'm the more time you spend in Hollywood, the less time you're spending in your organization organizing, because that takes up a lot of time. And so I just, and it's, to each, in the final analysis, to each their own. But this is why I talk a lot about ethics. And I have to constantly, like, so that's my ethics, right? And I'm not saying that people who do those other things are doing it wrong per se.
Mm-hmm.
Like, I think that they're a product of this milieu, but everybody can't be doing that.
Mm-mm.
And those people who are choosing that route are also the people in whom power is concentrated. That's the people who get the resources. That's the people who are called on to answer questions. And as they become less and less responsive to any type of collective, or less and less of a part of any collective, which inevitably happens over time, that is what becomes problematic, right? So I just try to keep a
Yeah.
dialectical analysis of that. Yeah.
I think that that's right. And I think it's right to keep, to follow that analysis, and to be able to make those distinctions. But I completely agree with you about how concerning it is. I think that what it looks like is a co optation of movement by
Mm-hmm.
making certain individuals celebrities at the expense of, having particular invitations that are meted out, what that means for the broader movement and what the horizon becomes, right? It's the
Mm-hmm.
same thing
Mm-hmm.
when the conflation becomes how I'm served is how everyone is served. And that is a very dangerous conflation. Um,
Mm-hmm.
so, not necessarily on that theme, but certainly on the theme of building power and creating change. Um, you know, Central to the analysis of race class is gender. And what you center here, I think you've called it in our conversation. I'm calling it patriarchy. I think I heard you call it male chauvinism. Is that right?
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Mm-hmm.
but that it is also constitutive of the construction of race and the construction of capitalism, that we can't understand one without the other. And sometimes, right, in our analysis, that's plainly obvious when we consider these, like, systems. The nuclear family is the greatest and most effective unit in order to ensure social control, right? How male-headed households both it reinforces, excuse me, the exploitable labor of women, and it maintains a system of private property, and the passage of wealth along patrilineal lines. Those things can be
Mm-hmm.
really, really clear. At the same time, women's labor remains incredibly invisibilized in the home to the point of normalcy. Sex work is criminalized, and you comment on this too. We see this too, but it's criminalized in a way that continues to punish women as deviants. Right?
Mm-hmm.
It reinforces her role in the broader social order in ways that we almost absolve everybody else that's involved in the sex work industry. But it's all based on this moralizing discourse, right, of where a woman
Mm-hmm.
should be, not just in the control of her body, but also in this capitalist system. So in the
Right.
process of curating these works along with Jodi Dean, what did the intellectual and organizing labor of Black communist women tell us that you found and reveal about the entwinements of race, class, and gender?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So one aspect of this, right, is the way that they struggled around fascism, or their anti-fascist critique. Much of what they pointed out is, so they pointed to like the triple K philosophy of like of Nazi Germany, which is children, kitchen, and church, and
Mm.
how that is a way of a form of like oppressing women, and that it is under a fascist regime that women are sort of the most oppressed and the most abjected. And what they point out is that, well, after World War II, during demobilization, Black women, but women in general, were being subjected to this same type of discourse. And what Claudia Jones says is that it seems that even the progressives don't know that this whole discourse is rooted in a sort of imperialist and a fascistic type of logic that's pushing women out of industry, pushing Black women back into domestic work through this male chauvinist or patriarchal discourse, and that is bound up in the drive to war. It's bound up in um, a means of disciplining women, for especially progressive women, for their active role in peace work. And so so part of what they show is that the attempt to control and discipline of women's labor generally, but Black women's labor particularly, is part of how we need to understand fascism and imperialism. Another way that they take up these intersections is for Black women, right? So you talk about Black women's work, or excuse me, women's work in the home and the way that's exploited, but Black women have historically had to work outside the home. So they've had to work in white women's homes and then in their own homes. And so part of what Claudia Jones talks about is that one of the reasons why Black women tend to be one of the most militant forces, and why they're essential to any peace movement or any proletarian struggle, is because they have historically been breadwinners in the family or have had to work outside of the home. And Thelma Dale points out that that reality is because of how Black men have been super exploited, right? Paid abysmally low wages, or have been structurally unemployed. And so the realities of capitalism shape how Black women and Black men are situated in like the global political economy, the national political economy, but also how they relate to the household. So that's another thing that needs to be taken into account. And the reality of working outside the home is true for Black women across class. Middle class women have had to do it less, or have had different types of occupations. They might be seamstresses or teachers, but they're still working outside the home in far greater numbers than other groups of women. Which then raises a question about how women relate to other women, because these Black women are domestic servants of other white women, right? The Bronx slave market is about how white women in the Bronx, primarily Jewish women who previously had not been able to afford a domestic servant, were super exploiting Black women, paying them crazy low wages, or no wages at all. And so this abstract notion of like sisterhood, or like, some abstract biological feminism based on being a woman, is not enough, because the class realities, the material realities, make their experiences distinct. um they also talk about the necessity of organizing and unionizing Black women, because they are at the bottom. They are protected by no labor legislation. They suffer from the sort of broader sort of social forces, but also the subjective forces that happen within the household. So, for example, being sexually harassed by husbands and brothers, or even sons of these white women they're working for. They don't have any. They don't have any of the labor protections that people who work in other types of sectors have. And then there's the way that if it is that you're always a maid, you're understood as the natural servant of others.
Mm.
And so part of why Black women emphasize domestic labor, and also Black women as workers, is because if you don't focus on them, then who you understand as a worker, what you understand as labor, and what you understand as organizing, is going to be truncated. And so, and the other thing I'll say is that, part of what they're not, you will never, the other difference between like our gender discourse now and theirs is that they'll never say like, as a Black woman, right? Or I can speak on this as a Black woman. What they're saying is that we are anti-imperialists, we are communists, right? We are workers. And this is the reality of that situation. And if we don't take this reality seriously, and it's not to say that we focus on this above all else. But if we don't include this in our analysis, if we don't check ourselves about how we sort of relate to different classes of workers, if we don't have an expansive understanding of what proletarian revolution is, we are not going to win. And so that, I think, is really important.
You know, I really appreciate the instruction that we get in terms of how is it that we organize, right? So not only in thinking about the what and the so what, but also thinking about the who, and you remind us, right? Who is a revolutionary comrade? This isn't about an audience. This is about a comrade, right? This is about who
Mm-hmm.
we're struggling alongside. So the displacement of identity politics that I hear you discussing here isn't to lessen the significance of that, but is to give it its rightful place insofar as it's describing a reality and how we organize, fight, win.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway,
Mm-hmm.
but what you're discussing here, right? The first point that you were making about the instructions that what we're getting from the intellectual and organizing legacies that you're lifting up here in this collection is also the significance of fascism and anti-imperialism, right?
Mm-hmm.
Where Black women in the United States fit in the rest of the world. And so here and elsewhere, again, I see your work continuing a rich tradition that understands Black struggle as anti-colonial struggle, right? You mentioned the Black Belt thesis earlier, but not merely in the Black Belt thesis and thinking about secession and independence, but far more broadly, also of thinking about the U.S. as a white settler colony, a white settler colonial project, right? That
Mm-hmm.
any kinds of freedoms within this political projects, within a constitutional order, might even reinforce abject domination abroad, right? And how
Mm-hmm.
our commitment to anti-imperialism implores us, right? Compels us to organize beyond those limitations. So
Mm-hmm.
can I'd love to hear you talk about this. This is also connected, right, to understanding Black protest as insurgency. We see Black
Mm-hmm.
protest as insurgency. It's rebellion. It's what, it's why James Baldwin, I remember James Baldwin in that, what was it, 1966 Nation article, who, any act of protest will be met with a form of a heavy hand because occupied territory is occupied territory. And
Mm-hmm.
how was that condition exploited by the US government in particular, right?
Mm-hmm.
Which collapsed, Black struggle with the Red Scare and
Mm-hmm.
anti-communism, so that they become intertwined in a way where if you are struggling in order to dismantle, white racism and capitalism as it's sutured, you're also part of a broader communist threat.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, thinking about like the last question first. So my book, Black Scare, Red Scare, is about this very phenomenon. And it's actually this connection, which I started thinking about in my dissertation, that brought me to racial capitalism. Because part of what I think understanding the Black Scare and the Red Scare, or anti-Black racial oppression and anti-radicalism together, conveys is that, the question is like, why is the U.S. hostile to Black people? Why is the U.S. Hostile to radicals, and radicalism being, or a particular type of radicalism that is about economic redistribution, that is anti-capitalist? And the U.S. is constitutively these two things. It hates Black people. It hates communists. Why? Well, if you if you hate those two things, if those two things are you construe them as un-American, subversive, seditious, threat to national security, that must mean you have a racial, or a political economy that is exploitative and rooted in racial hierarchy, which is racial capitalism, right? And so, part of the reason also why I think, so there's many reasons why these two things, the black, what I call the Black Scare and the Red Scare, thinking with a number of other people, Gerald Horne included, part of why those two things come together is because of the economic position of Black people. That if it is they're super exploited, if it is that super profit is extracted from Black people, from the so-called Black belt, then Black liberation is necessarily collapsing. It is an affront on political economy. And then if you're a communist and you're struggling for economic redistribution or overthrowing a system of capitalism and implementing socialism, that means the dreaded blacks are going to be the primary beneficiaries of that project, not least because they're at the bottom, right? And because the most surplus value is extracted from them. And so this is how they become understood together, that both effectively menace the sort of extant social order. There's also the question of internationalism, which you're raising, because if we take the whole body of work of Gerald Horne seriously, what he says is that Black people have generally organized internationally because they have been excluded from citizenship here, because this state is what reduces them to like absolute other. And so they've had to find comrades and allies and solidarity outside of the confines of the United States, which then on the one hand reifies their un-Americanness, the sort of the tenuous nature of their citizenship, their susceptibility to foreign inspiration and to subversion, but it also expands their cartography of struggle, right? And so Black people are have and it's not everybody, but Black people have black organizers, black radicals, right, have been internationalists because they understand that their situation is linked to imperialism. It's linked to, for example, the rise of the United States to global hegemony. Punish it. So that 1890s moment was the consolidation of Jim Crow, right? It was the colonization of Puerto Rico. It was the imperialist machinations in the Philippines and Cuba and the Dominican Republic, et cetera. And these are the same types of people. So the people who are fighting in the Confederacy go on to become generals in these wars and in these violent expeditions. These are the same people. So they're invested in a racial order that is that facilitates a particular type of accumulation as well. So what you see in this book is that Williana Burroughs, right, in the 1920s and 1930s, is talking about the conditions of Black women in the United States are very much akin to the conditions of women in Africa and in the Caribbean, right? That the ways they're in charge of production and reproduction and paid very low wages or nothing, and have the worst type, the most onerous and dangerous types of work, that resonates throughout the world. And so these are potential comrades. These are people that we need to be organizing with if we're actually going to have some type of proletarian revolution. And so, and Lenin understood this, right? Lenin writes these theses on the national and the colonial questions. And so, and I think that that's also part of the Black Belt Nation thesis. Why it's important is because if you understand the national character of Black oppression, if you understand Black people as an oppressed nation, then as Black people, you understand yourselves alongside India and nations in the Caribbean and South Africa and et cetera, right? But if you understand it only as a system of discrimination,
Mm-hmm.
then how you struggle and what you're struggling against is fundamentally different.
Mm-hmm. I think one of the things that you're raising is, right, this tradition of understanding racism and colonialism as being, inextricable. These are also reinforcing that they are the basis of an imperialist understanding. What happens in some of the work that I'm looking at of thinking even about apartheid, right? Apartheid is
Mm-hmm.
historically understood as a colonial project. And yet by 1998, when we see it legislated into the Rome Statute, describing it once again as a crime against humanity, it becomes neutered and domesticated as a racial question of discrimination, right? Every country is guilty of apartheid, and yet what we're leaving out of this picture is the colonial nature of that discrimination. That it's about the
Mm-hmm.
accumulation of wealth, of land, of ghettoized sovereignty, and so on and so forth. So how do these questions also get reshaped, right? Even
Mm-hmm.
politically co-opted, so that the horizon of our struggle becomes more limited.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Um,
And part of that too, I try to have, I go hard on the liberals for many reasons, but
mm,
like I think that what can happen over time is that people want things that they feel are winnable.
that's true.
Discrimination feels winnable,
So true.
where decolonization feels intractable.
Way over there, yeah.
Right. And I think that we have to, but if everybody keeps on negotiating the terms of their immiseration, then yes, it is not, it's unthinkable. But if the unthinkable thing is a thing that we're all moving toward, it's wholly possible. And this is why I rock with. So I have a lot of issues with Garvey. I write about him in my book, but part of what Garvey, his whole back to Africa thing is like, people are saying this is fantastical, like it's colonial, and it was some of those things. But he's like, it's no more fantastical than thinking these crackers, these white people who lynch you, are going to accept you as equal.
Mm-hmm.
So where is it that we're actually going to place our energies, and where do we have a broader base of unity? It's throughout the Black world. It is not with these racist white folks who keep telling you like, we don't like you, we hate you. Like, no, and so yeah.
Yeah, and full on, very explicitly participated in forced displacement and relocation in the name of
100%.
sustaining, a demographic majority and a superiority. I think this idea of how we think, what our political imagination looks like, you write about it very clearly. Again, in your Boston Review of Books review, I think it was something about it's far easier to consider we can just change the hearts and minds of a bunch of white
Mm-hmm.
people than it is to
Mm-hmm.
reorganize a global political economy that has created a racial class gendered hierarchy for us. And again, right, David Harvey, who says, right, it's far easier for us to imagine the end of the world than it is to imagine the end of capitalism, right? But why? But
Mm-hmm.
why?
Well, somebody tell David Harvey that race matters. That's all I want for him. I want him to take racial analysis seriously. I like a lot of what he does, and I'm like, hey, guy, race too.
I think
So
that's a great start to the letter, though. Hey, guy.
yeah.
Here's what, yeah.
Hey, fella.
But speaking of letters that you'd like to write, you do identify as an academic, and you have come up through training, commitment, and practice um, in a field known as Black Studies. I've heard you, I've heard you in many places describe, part of the work that you're doing and your commitment is also to this intellectual field. It's very much to the world that we live in and how we change it, but it's also to the ways that we understand ourselves, the way we study ourselves, right? These epistemological projects as well. So can you share with us your critique of Black studies and
Mm-hmm.
also how your work is, if you think so, right? I think so, is helping to reshape it as well.
Yeah. So my whole dissertation was about Black studies, and the question that started it all was really like, why are there no political economists in Black studies? There were very few to almost none, and me and my friend were like looking for this, right? Um, and so that started this whole thing because in the 1968, 1969 moment when there's these protracted struggles for Black studies departments or third world colleges that then got reduced to programs. Um, there were the Marxist forces, there were the nationalists, there was a few liberals, like there's the Yale Symposium. So the Marxists were there, right? And almost everybody was anti-imperialist in some fashion, not least by understanding themselves as sort of denizens of the third world in the belly of the beast. And so the question is like, when as Black studies became more institutionalized, like what happened to that critical edge, or what became known as the critical edge? Like what happened to um you know a scientific socialist, right? A dialectical materialist analysis that was very much there from the outset, that was very much constitutive of that struggle for Black studies. And so part of my critique is that it's overdetermined by what I call culturalism. So the abstraction of culture from any analysis of political economy or material condition. It's overdetermined by a particular type of gender studies that can bend toward identity reductionism. Identity politics, as defined by the Combahee River Collective, is important. Identity reductionism is not. It is problematic, right? And I think that the field is over determined by a type of careerism and professionalization that I think moved away from the initial goal of Black studies, which was to unite so-called gown and town. So the university with the surrounding communities, with the broader world at large. Black studies was a responsibility. It wasn't a privilege. And I don't know that it's a responsibility anymore. It's become many things. And then there's the whole question of how it's still dominated by people trained in traditional disciplines, and how they become particular types of gatekeepers that are deeply hostile
Mm-hmm.
to those of us who have PhDs in the field, which is so wild because it's like, why are we having PhDs if we're going to be hostile to people who have PhDs in the field? That's crazy. And so there's a number of issues. In terms of my work, sort of maybe because these things are not, they're not sort of they're not ontological, right? These are historical developments, and so things shift one way, they can shift another way. And so I'd like to think that my work is helping to sort of bring a critical political economy analysis back in. It's helping to bring the importance of organizing and non-academic thought and non-academic sites of knowledge production back into Black studies. All at the same time, sometimes I'm like, well, maybe my work is post Black studies. Like, if I believe my own analysis, maybe my work is not Black studies in terms of what it is now and what it's become. So I'm not certain, I don't have a lot of, I don't read a lot of the newer Black study stuff. Now, granted, I do a lot of historical work, but it's also like, it's a lot of theorizing off of theory. It's a lot of abstraction. It's the memoir industrial complex has taken over.
Oh no.
It's a lot of that. And so I'm not certain. So I feel like my work, I am a Black studies scholar. I'm classically trained from my BA to my PhD in it. I work in Black studies. I've worked only in Black studies programs or departments. Um, but you know, I don't know. It's I don't know.
I don't.
I just
I find the uncertainty refreshing because
yeah.
it's filled with possibility, and like you
Hmm.
said, it is not ontological. It is contingent, and so I think that
Hmm.
uncertainty is also quite instructive and very powerful. But it's something to be mindful of as well, right? How
Hmm.
do these fields become more palatable? As somebody, I'm in an Africana Studies department. I'm also very squarely in Palestine Studies, and
Hmm.
so these are things that we discuss as well. Like how have our scholars and our scholarship and knowledge production shifted over time in ways that not only have we, followed the discipline, but we've become disciplined to a
Hmm.
fault,
Hmm.
right? How
Hmm.
do we become disciplined to a fault? And what does it mean to constantly also rebel within? Um,
And how do we? Just one thing to add is like
yeah.
we have so academics are megalomaniacs with inferiority complexes. That is like a quintessential academic. Maybe I want to,
I don't think
but I
any academic would disagree though, like especially not if you're in this. Yeah.
yeah, but and so I just wish we had more like humility. Like Black studies
Mm,
had more humility because people will say like will praise thinkers and work, whatever, such as myself, right? But then when it comes to search committees,
I know.
all of that stuff comes up, and that is how you shift a field. Like people have to have jobs, right? People have to have access to resources to do the types of work that ostensibly we value. And so, I think, and then again, that becomes so people's ostensible radical politics become a subterfuge for practices that are deeply antithetical to actually existing radicalism. And Black studies is very guilty of that. I'll just leave it there.
But it's also something to keep in mind about how agentic one is even in the academy, because that's a space of political organizing as well. The departments
A
that you
hundred percent.
build, what you're doing, the knowledge production. I mean, I think that becomes a site of organizing as well. Um, I wanted to ask you a few follow up questions, but we are at time. Let me just lift this up for folks. Dr. CBS was lifting up, with the political economy. We're the political economists in Black Studies. I think that her work is shining a light on them. Many of them in the existing works that you've already put out, Charisse, but also in the forthcoming works that we look forward to seeing. Thank you so much for so many instructive moments. This last gem that you dropped for us to remember, lifting up the Combahee River statement of reductionism versus identitarianism in terms of how we think about, identity, and what those distinctions are, so that we can move with nuance, with grace, with complexity, all in the service of our collective liberation. So
Hmm.
thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. It was fun.
See you soon. I hope in real life.
Yeah. Yes. All right. Bye bye.
Bye. Bye.